This video will go over setting up test type parameters in NCS Plus. First we'll want to go into our test protocol setup screen, and to get there we either go into F6 setup and click test protocols, or go to edit and select test protocols. And now we're going to select the NCS Plus as the test protocol that we want to set up. And then here's all of our different tabs for setting up this test protocol. So the test tabs is how we set up the specific tests. I'm going to go over the test types tab and maybe a little bit of the general tab in this video. In the test types tab, I'm mainly going to cover just setting up the parameters and options per test type, and we'll show the result tables set up in a different video. As you go through different test types in NCS Plus, each test type has its own parameter set and the result table set. So we'll start with motor. You can always name this something else. You can put in a different name other than motor, and also put in a short name or an abbreviated name. Here's where you'll set up your amplifier. You can choose which channel you use as a default for motor nerves, what filters you want to use, and whether or not you want to have the notch filter turned on as a default. You'll set up all your stimulator settings in this next section. This is where you can set up your pulse width, your stim count. If you want to do trains or anything, this is where you'd set up your stim trains. You can decide whether you want to reset intensity between each site, or if you want to keep the intensity. So if you check this box between each site, the intensity is going to go back to 0. If you keep it unchecked, then it's going to remember your intensity from the previous site. The next section is your display. This is where a lot of your options come in. So first thing, obviously, you'd set up your default sweep and gain for motor tests, and then you would set up whether those should be linked in each site, so that all the sites have the same sweep and same gain. You can decide whether to use the glowing feature, which allows you to see your trace history kind of disappear into the background as you acquire data. You can choose how many traces are shown and the duration that they stay on the screen. You can decide whether to use auto history, which basically automatically turns trace history on every time you acquire data. And you can also pick what type of trace history you want to use. So your options are +1, which gives you kind of radio buttons, and when you hover over them you can see one trace at a time compared with your selected trace. Or if you choose all traces, when you hit trace history, it shows all the traces that you stimulated for that site. And then +5 is just going to show 5 at a time. You can choose whether you want to set up a delay in the trace window. Decide whether you want to use the XY align function. This is using the raster overlay button. You can hit it a third time, and it overlays both the sites and the XY axis, so it puts the responses right on top of each other if you have this checked. It's kind of a nice feature for comparing amplitudes and such. Decide whether you want to show reference limits in the trace window. So if this is checked, when you move a cursor and there's a reference limit associated with that cursor, you see a green background shaded area showing that the reference limit range. Hold Mmax. This is specific for motor nerves, and this is the feature that allows it to always select the super maximal response as the selected trace. So even if you stim a lower response, it's not keeping your last trace as the selected trace, it's keeping the super maximal trace. The overlay all trials. This is if you've done multiple trials on a single site. If this is checked, when you go and click to look at your trials, it overlays all the trials on top of each other for easy comparison, and you can pick how long those trials stay overlaid, the duration of that overlay. Trace info. This is information that you can display on the actual site itself, right next to the trace. So you can decide what things you want to show on that trace. And then the status bar info. This is what shows up when you point to a trace. In the bottom of the trace window is a status bar. You can have different site and trace information displayed in the status bar, and this is where you can decide what is shown in that status bar. You can decide whether you want the averager on. Typically you wouldn't use the averager in motor waves, so you can just have it unchecked. If you turn it on, it gives you some additional parameters you can set up for the averager. We'll go over that in the sensory test type. And then custom keys. This is how you set up what your different stim controller buttons do and what your foot switch does for this particular test. For F waves, again, you can name them whatever you want and also give it an abbreviated name. Decide on your amplifier settings, on your stimulator settings. Some unique things here is if you have the use M stimulator checked, then this is going to use this, it's going to start in the same intensity where you found the wrist motor site. So for example, if you're doing a median motor wrist and you found supermaximal at 55 milliamps, when you come into F wave, if this is checked, it will start your intensity at 55 milliamps. Again, pulse width, any other things you want to set up as far as this stimulator goes, is done in this section here. In the display, some things are similar to your motor options. However, a couple of things in F waves, you have signal improve. If this is checked, what it does is on the F wave side of the sweep line, it's going to subtract out the M waves, so you get a flatter baseline for your F waves. So if that's checked, it'll usually improve your baseline for your F waves to give you a less sloped baseline. If individual F waves is checked, it's going to give you individual cursors for each F wave, and it will give you, rather than just the common F marker. If you're doing individual cursors, you also want to make sure you set up in your result tables what you want to see in the F waves, so it gives you the correct cursors. You can set up a delay. MF splitter, this is just the position of the split line between the motor gain and the F gain. So here you can set up a default gain for the motor response and a separate default gain for the F wave response, and then a split line to separate the two. MF overlay, this allows, if this is checked, it allows you to see the F wave in both a rastered view as well as an overlay view at the same time. So you'll see all your F waves separated and overlaid on top of each other. And then again, your show reference limits option. Choose whether you want to raster overlay as a default, and then again your trace info. Maybe you want to see trace number and stim intensity, for example. What information is shown in the status bar. This is the information at the bottom of the trace window when you have a site selected. And then your additional settings is a shutoff. So this is going to, if we set this for 10, for example, if you are using run stop after you acquire 10 F waves, it's going to stop acquiring data. And then your custom keys, these are your stim controller buttons, 1, 2, and 3, and your foot switch buttons for F wave tests. For sensory, we have, again, amp settings, stimulator settings, all very similar to the motor. You have your display, your sweeps and gains. Some differences here is you have, again, how, the glowing, whether you want to use that or not. For glowing for sensories, you may not want to see as many traces on the screen. It may get a little bit too confusing to have too many traces showing on the screen when you're acquiring data. So you may want to turn that down to 2 or 3 traces, and you can pick how long those traces stay on the screen while you're acquiring data. You can turn on your auto history if you want, where it automatically displays your trace history while you're acquiring data, and decide what type of trace history to see. Signal improve, this is specific to sensory nerves, and this is going to actually subtract out any slow artifact out of the baseline to give you a flatter baseline. I probably wouldn't recommend using this as a default. The F1 key turns this on or off. I'd probably leave the signal improve off, and then you can just turn it on when you need it by pushing F1. So I would probably recommend leaving that unchecked for normal, your typical sensory nerves. Allow peak markers to cross. This is just as far as when you're moving cursors. Do you want to always keep the cursors in order, of onset, peak, etc. If this is checked, you can actually move, the peak cursor over before the onset cursor. If this is unchecked, it always keeps the cursors in that order. Delays, X, Y align, again, that's the overlay option. Whether you show reference limits, you have your trial overlay, your trace info, your status bar info, and you can pick what is shown in the status bar when you're doing a sensory test. And then your averager info, so typically you have this on for sensory as an option. I probably wouldn't turn the averager on as a default. You can easily turn it on with a button on the base unit. But you can turn the averager on, decide whether you want to use an auto reject on the averager, reset on turn on. What this does is if this is checked, every time you turn on and off the averager and then turn it on again, it clears out your previous averages. So you can reselect new averages. If this is unchecked, it remembers what you'd already selected previously in that set of traces, and you can add to that. So this basically zeroes out the averages every time you start and stop the averager. The inhibit time, this is how long the live or input trace shows on the screen while you're acquiring data in averager mode. So you'd see the average trace, and then it's set for milliseconds. So for a millisecond, the input trace would show, so you can see the live trace at the same time. If you put that down to 0, then you wouldn't see the live trace when you're acquiring an averaged signal. And then you can set a shut off for the averager, so it shuts off after X amount of simulations. And then of course your custom keys for sensory nerves. I typically would set up stim1 as distance, stim2 as next test, and then I usually use stim3 as trace history, because often you need to go into trace history for sensories, maybe pick a previous trace, and then you can set whatever you want for your foot switch. And H-reflex, similar to F-waves for the most part, you can decide obviously your amplifier settings, your stimulator settings. You can decide to use fine controls in your intensity so that you can change by the decimal point your milliamps rather than just by whole number in milliamps. Your rep rate, your display settings, it looks somewhat similar to your F-waves. However, you have the option to start H analysis after X amount of milliseconds. You can pick whether you want to see the overlay and rastered traces at the same time, kind of like F-waves, what trace info you want to display on the site itself, and what info you want in the status bar, and then again how you want to set up your stim buttons and your foot switch. Now once you have all this set up for your test types, when you create a test, so if we go into a test and just pick a test here, anytime you enter a site into a test, so this test has 4 sites in it, if it is a motor site, and these are set for default, then it's going to use all the default parameters for that particular site. If you want a particular site to use a different parameter, you can go to that site. So let's say for this site, we want it to use a different display parameter, and maybe we want, so we'd uncheck default so that we can use different parameters. So now it's going to use whatever I select here as the parameter for that site instead of the default motor parameter. And you can choose whether you want different amplifier parameters, stimulator parameters, display or averager parameters, and that's per site. If you wanted to create a totally different test, maybe you wanted to create a mag stim test or a reflex hammer test, what I would recommend doing is actually coming over to NCS Plus and just copying that protocol and paste, and that gives you a whole new NCS Plus protocol. And now I can come in here. This one has stayed the same, so nothing I do to NCS Plus 2 will affect this original NCS Plus. They share the same anatomy database, but other than that, nothing else is shared between these two tests. So I'm going to go into NCS Plus 2, and if I slow click or right click and rename, I can call it something else. So let's just say we wanted to call this a mag stim protocol, or maybe a maybe we want to do like a motor evoked potential protocol, something. Yeah. Let's call it mag stim. And now we can take this protocol, we can go ahead and we can delete out all these tests because we don't need these. We can go to test type, and what I'd probably do is pick the test type that most closely fits what you want to accomplish in that particular test. So for mag stim protocol, maybe I want to call this test type MEPs or something. So I'm going to rename it MEP and short name, whatever you want to do. You don't really need one if MEP is short enough. And then you can come in and pick what parameters you want to do. So here I'm going to do mode, and I'm going to change this to, actually, sorry, I'm going to do stim, and I want to do either trigger in or trigger out and which input you want to use. So I'm going to do a trigger out mag stim. So what that means is when I hit the stim button on the Sierra Summit, it triggers out and triggers the mag stim to fire. If I did a trigger in, then when I fired the mag stim, it would then automatically tell the Sierra Summit to trigger and collect data at that point. So you pick what stim type you want to use, and then you can go ahead and set up all your other parameters just like you would in any other test that will fit the closest you need for that particular protocol. And there's really no limit to how many of these you can create. So maybe I wanted to create another one called reflex hammer. I can do that. That's how you can set up different test types and different parameters for different test types in NCS Plus. While I'm going over test types, general is another tab that just has a few different settings in it. General settings are settings that don't really belong anywhere else. They're more test-wide for all NCS Plus tests. And the things that are in this tab are you can decide for your temperature probe, you can actually set up different positions, so you can select what placement or where you put your temp probe. So you can set up positions for that. In your display, you can decide whether you want to show all tests for one of your views in NCS Plus, whether you want to auto hide traces for either view 1 or view 2 in NCS Plus. You can choose how you want to draw the traces. So you have a couple options. You have our original drawing. You can do anti-aliased 1 pixel or anti-aliased 2 pixels. Our default is 2 pixels. Just gives you a little bit bolder, kind of nice looking response line, I think. Results, you can you can tell it what to call your no response when you push the no response button or when its response isn't found. You can tell the software what that should be called. Just NR or no response or no result, whatever you want to call it. You have a few options. For example, if you don't want to see decimals in the conduction velocity or in the amplitude, in sensories, you can adjust those things. You can include results from other tests when you're testing. So if you're doing like a median motor and you want to see anything else that has the median nerve in it, if you have that checked, you would see other tests as well. And disable distance dialog, this is just going to mean if you have the stim controller set up for entering distance and this is checked, then when you push the stim controller, you're not going to see the pop-up to enter the distance. It's just going to allow you to change the distance that's in the box. And then you can use different distance increments, either 1 millimeter, 0.1 centimeter, or 5 millimeters, 0.5 centimeters. So that is your test parameters or test type parameters for NCS Plus in Sierra Summit 3.1.